we are good. So, welcome back to another week of Torah. It's good times. So, there's actually a lot in Parshat Ekev that we could be looking at, and I was a little torn trying to think what would make the most sense. We have in this week's parsha the verse V'achalta v'savachta uverachta. Right? You'll eat and be sated and you'll bless, which we actually say in Birkat Hamazon, and the rabbis go off of that to give us all their explanation for why that is the proof text for Birkat Hamazon. I thought we could go into that, but it's interesting, but it doesn't challenge us, I think, that much philosophically. We also have the second paragraph of the Shema, the V'haya im Shemoah paragraph, which is a really good test philosophically, but the rabbis didn't struggle with it. The commentators didn't struggle with it as much as we may struggle with it today. But there's a bit smacked in between these two sections that I think actually poses a lot of questions for so many of us and for so many generations. This has been the case. So we're actually looking at the majority of chapter 8 from Deuteronomy, which is the second chapter in this parsha. And we're going to take a look at these 9 verses and see what some rabbis have to say. It's a pretty challenging theology, I think, for a modern mind. That being said, I think once we start to kind of wrap our minds around it, it all does start to make a lot more sense and gives us a new appreciation for things. So this is going to be a much more Hasidic approach to learning today. So any questions or thoughts before we jump in? Phil.
Is this the parsha where you're supposed to, when you're laning it, you do it in a very quiet voice?
No.
Or is this, no, this isn't the one with the curses.
We don't have the curses here. That's a little bit later on. Okay. So here we go. We're going to jump right on in from the parsha. So, take care lest you forget Adonai your God and fail to keep God's commandments, rules, and laws, which I enjoin upon you today. When you have eaten your fill and have built fine houses to live in, and your herds and flocks have multiplied, and your silver and gold have increased, and everything you own has prospered, beware lest your heart grow haughty and you forget Adonai your God, who freed you from the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness, with its seraph serpents and scorpions and parched land with no water in it, who brought forth water for you from the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your ancestors had never known, in order to test you by hardships, only to benefit you in the end. And you say to yourselves, my own power and the might of my own hand have won this fortune for me. Remember that it is Adonai your God who gives you the power to gain fortune in fulfillment of the covenant that God swore to your ancestors, as is still the case. If you do forget Adonai your God and follow other gods to serve them or bow down to them, I warn you this day that you shall certainly perish. Like the nations that Adonai will cause to perish before you, so shall you perish, because you did not heed Adonai your God. Okay. So this, in and of itself, I think, raises, maybe some difficulties for us. But one of the reasons why I was actually so drawn to this, besides the fact that I love this theology, is there's this really interesting word here. So, oh, no, it didn't work. Hold on. Here we go. This word, yerbun, right here. Oh. There we go. Okay, so Raz is joining us now. So this word here, yerbun, or yerbun, it's really strange. Normally you would think it would be yerbun. Something will increase. Your bakar, your cattle, your herds, uvitzon. And son is going to be your flocks of sheep. So if your herds and your flocks will increase. So normally be yerbun or yerbu. But here the Vav changes to a Yud, which is really strange. And in fact, this is the only place in all of Tanakh, in all of Tanakh that this appears, which makes it that much more unique and should really draw our attention to it. And what's even weirder is that the next words, right? V'chesef v'zahav yerbelach, right? So here we have your herds and your flock will increase, and your silver and your gold will increase for you. But here it just says yerbeh. It's singular, where even though kesef and zahav together aren't singular, they are plural. And then here we have bakar and son, plural, using this very strange plural future form. So there's weird stuff going on here, which really should be drawing our attention to it. Right? That's usually how the commentators work. Right? They find something that is just odd, and that draws their eyes in. So here we have some, and by the way, the commentary that we have to explain that is pretty lacking. Ibn Ezra explains a little bit of the grammatical structure and why it appears this way. And the Baal HaTurim explains, it's very strange. It's like the yud in place of a vav is to let you know that if you take your flocks if you graze your flocks in another person's field, your wealth will diminish. How he gets to that from this, he's a Kabbalist in some ways, and I don't understand at all his explanation there. But that's it. Nobody else has anything to say about this really strange grammatical construct. So, but either way, it should draw our attention. Okay. But that aside, we're looking at this text. Yes, Raj, do you have a question?
Yeah, before we move on, if you said something about this before, I apologize. How do they know that the yud instead of a vav isn't just a scribal mistake? You're speaking of it as if they're sure it's deliberate. How is that known?
Because we don't have a tradition of it being a scribal error. The rabbis would say that if it were a scribal error, they would say there was a scribal error, but we don't have a tradition of them saying that. So therefore we assume that that's not the case.
That it was put there for some purpose or other, and the question is, what's the purpose?
Correct. Okay.
Thank you.
So we have this very challenging philosophy here that, first of all, the context is it's very easy to see yourself coming into a lot of wealth and feeling very comfortable. And the idea is that when you're struggling, it's really easy to remember God. But when you are doing really well, it's very easy to forget God. And this is also connected to the idea of why we say, Ve'achalta v'savata u've'rachta, you eat and you're sated, then you bless. Because if you eat and you're not sated, you might still bless because you want some more. But if you eat and you're sated, it's really easy just to kind of grow complacent and maybe like fall asleep, and you forget to bless God, and you forget to acknowledge God, which is one of the reasons why we also bless before we eat. The other reason we bless before we eat is because suddenly everything is God's, and if I drink this water without blessing over it first, it's as if I'm stealing from God. So by blessing, I actually kind of transfer ownership in a way from God to me, or like transfer permission, so that I can then consume this. And if I don't bless over it, I'm taking from God. So the idea is, it's a lot easier to remember to bless beforehand also than it is to remember to bless afterwards. We also have in Parshat Ha'azinu, the very end of the Torah, Moses reminds us again the parable of a heifer growing fat and kicking the rancher. That it's we don't want to be like that. That we don't want to grow fat off the land and take for granted the one who's enabled us to get there. So this is a philosophy that repeats itself numerous times, specifically in Deuteronomy. And so that in of itself also should demand our attention. But it's right. We say God brought us out of Egypt. Right? God fed us with manna. God made sure that we had water when there was no water, especially after Miriam died. Right? God did all these things for us. And yet we might forget that. And we might think, well, no, I busted my butt. And it's because of my efforts that I'm able to enjoy that which I am enjoying in my life. And we're being told, don't think that. Check yourself before you go that route, because if you forget that everything is there because of God, you'll be no different than all the other people. Okay. Any questions, thoughts before we go on a little bit to see what the rabbis have to say about all this? Yeah, Phil.
It actually, if you think about it, I think in common practice, it is much more common to say the blessings before we eat, and it's usually before events occur. And saying the Birkat Hamazon is not quite as done, I don't think, as nearly as much. And philosophically, it definitely should be, or theologically, it really is important. But it just doesn't. After you've eaten your meal, you, like you say, you're not thinking about, you should be, and we should do it more at Mishkan or whatever. But it just seems it's just not done nearly as much.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty standard practice, right? Even at like summer camps and youth groups and whatever else. Right? Everyone says, "Oh, we're going to do hamotzi together," and then how many of us actually bless full Birkat Hamazon, right? If we do bless something, maybe oftentimes we'll even just say Brich Rachmana, something one line, something really short, which is better than nothing. Right? But the idea of, come on, we're tired, we just ate. Let's save ourselves a little bit of energy. Okay, so let's see the true source of our strength. So let's see what Malbim has to say about this. And this will be, there's actually another source at the very end of this source sheet. So if you're looking at the PDF online, if you downloaded that, I included another source from Rabbeinu Bachya, which is very long. And I didn't think it was added that much to the conversation here. But let's see what Malbim has to say here. It says, remember, right, the verse, remember that it was God who did all this for you. Here, Moses responds that even if you forget the lessons of antiquity, you should remember that even the fortune you gather now, even if it is done with the power of your hand and your efforts, it is not actually done with your strength. And the word here, there's a lot of weird power and strength and effort and all these different phrases. So I want to make sure we actually understand the words that are being used here. So the word chayil, like we say, Eshet Chayil, and usually it's translated as a woman of valor. Chayil is valor. But all the rabbis agree that Chayil here really means like wealth. So I'm using the word fortune for Chayil in my translation here. And I did the translation here for Malbim. But the word fortune is what's used for Chayil. And then we have the word otzem yad, or otzem yadcha. And otzem is going to be strength, like that. Those other people, like we grew into an rav atzum, numerous and strong. And atzum means like strong. But so otzem yad is like the strength of your hand, right? Here we have the word hishtadlut. Hishtadlut is your strife, like you struggle to do something. And then we have the word koach. And koach, that is what we're using. I'm translating the word koach as strength here. Otzem yad is going to be as effort or power of your hand. And chayil is going to be fortune. So I just want to make sure that we understand which words are which here. And koach, we know it's often like it's koach, like you have that strength. We want to understand kind of what the differences are here. Okay. So you should remember that even the fortune you gather now, even if it is done with the power of your hand and your efforts, it is not actually done with your strength, because your inner strength, your koach panimi, right, which allows you to gain fortune with the power of your hands, right? So you have this internal strength that kind of manifests itself to be able to do things with your own hands. And by using your hands, you're able to earn a living, to gain your fortune. Right? That is actually a strength which flows down from above, meaning it's flowing down from God. And the word here is mashpia or shefa. And shefa is this idea of like a divine flow, something that's flowing down from God to us. So there's this flow, it's the strength which flows down from above, that all movement done below is done through a higher strength, that God pours down and places in you life and strength so that you can move your hand and limbs to gain fortune. And the reason God gives you strength to gain fortune through the power of your hand is in order to uphold God's covenant, which God swore to your ancestors. Therefore, you must guard or observe shomer, right, the word here, shamor, God's commandments, so that you will always have this strength, this covenant, and grace, which were promised to your ancestors. Okay. Any questions on this idea here? Thoughts? Yeah, Phil.
Well, in a meditation that I had many years ago, and I asked God for strength to deal with situations in my life, the answer I got back in the meditation was, you already have the strength. You just need to uncover that. We all have that strength. We all have that. We all know the choice. We all have that within us already. We need to uncover it. Now, the original source of that strength, that definitely could be from Hashem. But the answer I was getting was, you really have the strength within you already. You just need to uncover all the schmutz that prevents you from getting to that place and getting to that strength. And so I think it's a little bit different. It's a different either take or somewhat of a different theology than this.
I'd say that, I mean, it's a very nice teaching, right? And it's, I mean, it is more or less the same as what we say at the end of Mizmor LaDavid, at the end of Psalm 29, we say, Adonai oz le'amo yitain. God gives us strength, right? So we know that we have that strength. The question is, have we tapped into it? Do we acknowledge it? Are we harnessing it? But this is a little different, which is saying that, like, when you catch a fish and you've spent, first of all, you spent hours just kind of sitting there watching your line, waiting for it to bob just a little bit, right? And then you get a little bit of tug on your line, and then you spend all this time really like reeling it back in, and you're reeling, and then you're pulling your rod back, and you're putting in a lot of effort. And you might think that you are the one who caught that fish, right? Of course, you caught that fish. You're the one who did all that work. But how were you able to catch that fish? What did you need to do to be able to catch that fish, Phil?
I had to use my strength. I had to use my skills. And oftentimes you use the expression, my God-given strength or my God-given skills.
God-given talent, right?
Given, if you want to say, yeah. But, I got to tell you, Rabbi, after I had that meditation, it really changed my perspective on things. And I don't ask God for strength anymore right now. I ask God to help me access the strength.
But let me ask you, so when you catch a fish, right, you have to be able to hold on to that rod really hard, right? You got to be able to tug it back. You got to there's a whole process that goes into being able to do it well, right? If you do it too fast, you might lose the fish. Too slow, the line might break because there's too much, stress on it for too long of a time, right? There's so many things that could go wrong there, right? So how are you actually able to do it? It's by, you actually have physical strength. Well, what gives you the physical strength? Well, you sleep, hopefully, and rest enables your body to regenerate and to be able to do what it needs. And you eat well, right? To be able to get the calories to be able to do it, right? So where does that food come from that you're able to eat? Well, you went to the store and you bought it, or you ordered it online, or whatever it was that happens, right? Well, okay, but where did that come from? What does our religion come from? It comes from the seed. And the conversation I have with my daughter all the time is, right, even if the food is coming from that seed, you can't just magic a seed out of nothing. It has to come from something. Well, where does all that come from? And if you go back to the original source, the idea would be it comes from God. And of course, you need the power of the sun to be able to grow that seed. And you need water. And where does all that come from? Well, we didn't make that. And this is, I think, what we often lose sight of. Right? We often think that everything that we are doing is strictly because we've done it. How do you even know to fish? Because somebody taught you how to fish. You didn't just figure out how to bend a little bit of metal into a hook and attach this filament to it and figure out how to make it all. You didn't do that. Somebody passed that down to you. And so we often fall into this trap thinking that everything that we have is due to ourselves and due to our own efforts. And studies actually show men fall victim to this thinking far more than women do. There's been surveys of CEOs of like Fortune 500 companies, and those who are women often attribute their success to their teachers and to their teams and to their family who have enabled them to be able to get there, their parents who, provided for their education, whatever it might be. Whereas men, the male CEOs, vast majority of them say it was through my own hard work that I got here, right? They don't mention the fact that they got the incredible team working for them. They don't mention the fact that their parents, enabled them to be able to get the education that they needed to be able to do it all. They don't think about the person who gave them that first internship, which led to the first job and taught them on the job, right? They forget about all that and like, no, it's my own hard work. And that is folly. It's true folly because it's not true, because everything is like, we are the result of everything else. We are actually channeling everything that's been passed down to us. Or in other words, there's this shefa, there's this flow that is pouring out, and we are funneling it into the direction that we want it to go. Right. So
but we also can get into the trap of relying on God, waiting for God to act, so that before we act, like we're praying for miracles or whatever. And I love the example of Nachshon. I think Nachshon is a perfect example, because Nachshon, when they were at the edge of the Reed Sea, the Sea of Reeds, and people are saying, what are we going to do? The Egyptians are coming there. God, help us. And God said, wait a minute, you guys have to act. Don't cry to me. You guys have to move. You have to do something. You have to take an action. So it's this idea that Nachshon really got. And Nachshon, dove into the sea, and everybody followed him because he exhibited that strength.
So I just want to be careful that we're not conflating two different things here, though. One is the idea that we already have this strength within us and acknowledging that it's there, that we have that strength. The other is acknowledging where that strength actually comes from, right? And those are two different ideas.
I agree.
Like Nachshon, yes, like we can do it and just keep going, right? And same with Yehoshua and Caleb. They feel like, no, we can do this. There's kind of this optimism and realizing they have the ability to move forward with it. But there's a difference between that and saying, but where does my ability come from? And we actually know, we look elsewhere in the Torah, we have the story of Bezalel, who is, in charge of building the Mishkan. And even there, the Torah tells us explicitly that God has imbued within him Chokhmah, Da'at, that Bezalel has been given wisdom and knowledge and understanding to be able to do these things.
I like that distinction a lot. It sounds like, yes, the strength you already have within you was given to you by God. It really comes, but you have to access that strength you have to use it. You have to act. You cannot wait for God to act,
yes, but I want us to stay clear. Like that is a different conversation. Yes, like you can't just sit around and like do nothing. Like that is true. And that's a very important conversation, but that's a different conversation than today. Just this conversation in and of itself is a very challenging idea for a lot of people. So like, can I say, I've got my new phone,
You're
it's
freezing,
a great phone.
Rabbi.
I love, I have this expensive phone and I get upset if, my daughter takes it because maybe she's going to break it. And I'm like, don't break it. Why am I so upset if she breaks it? Because I spent a lot of money to get it. Well, what does that matter? Well, I had to work to be able to have that money to be able to buy it. Well, what does that matter? Well, it was hard effort. Well, that's fine, but it wasn't mine to begin with. Right? I'm only able to do my job because God gave me a mind that is able to process the information in front of me that has enabled me to become a rabbi. I only have the ability to move my body and do the things that I need to be able to do because I've been gifted with that life force. Whether it is a direct gift from God and God has specifically targeted me to give it, which is a philosophy I don't subscribe to, but plenty of other people do. I do believe that everything originally comes back from some original source, some original creator, and all of that has fed into my ability to be here in this moment doing the things that I do. And so, yes, I could get upset about this because it's actually not because I had to put time and effort to be able to make the money to be able to buy the phone, and God forbid it break. It's also because it's wasteful, right? The time that I spent doing this to be able to get this could be time and use my use of God's given energy to be able to do something else, to be able to teach somebody, to be able to reach out to somebody, to be able to learn something new. But instead I have to worry about dealing with something else. This getting something once and then having a break or whatever else then becomes a waste of that gift from God. And so I'm not so much upset that I have to do more and earn more. I'm upset that that which has been given to me by God has now been wasted, and I have to kind of do it all over again instead of doing more of God's work. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Do any of you struggle with this as a philosophy? Because, and Phil, I'm going to ask you to kind of mute yourself because everybody else has been kind of quiet at this point. Does anybody else do you struggle with this idea that, God, that the only reason you can do the things that you can do is because God made it so that you can do that?
I'm very much in line with you. I see it as a respect of heritage, a respect of parental love, right? We do things to honor our fathers and mothers, and I don't necessarily say, hey, I got this because of God. I think more of, my parents did this, my grandparents did that, my great-grandparents had this. You should see, I spent so much time on Ancestry building my family tree.
Awesome.
And I look at the history and I think I have to continue this thing because in order to honor those who came before me. So to me, it's less of a godly gift and more of a family gift. All of this DNA that's combined in a certain way. But it's still overall, it's the same. It's a very similar thought process. It's that I didn't get here on my own. This wasn't dumb luck. It wasn't my own work. There's something else that's organized that brought me to the position that I'm in. That's sort of my feel on it.
And I also think, Aaron, having the background that we have in BBYO and the knowledge of everything that goes into making things happen and having to work within the team, I think gives us that much more appreciation than maybe others may have. How much of the skills that you use in your day-to-day life did you actually get from high school, actually learning in school, versus did you get from CLTC and learning how to actually organize? And yeah, Russell, how about you?
I think there are two completely different strands that are challenging about this. One is, in a certain sense, it's the easy part to talk about, here are these good things that happened and they came from God. The harder part is to talk about the bad fortune, the weakness, all of that. So where did that come from? Was that mean is that because God deserted you? Is that because you're at fault? So there's that whole strand that sort of becomes one challenge. But then the other piece that in some ways to me is more intellectually interesting is so if you separate the notion of teamwork, right, that there's a value in not saying I did this all myself because you need people to when you're hunting with 6 people, you need to work together as a team or as a CEO. There's that value. But this to me is sort of that's not what this is saying. This is not saying you need to work with other people. This is saying you need to recognize that the source of the good things you have came from God. So then there is, in a sense, there is a question which is, okay, so what? What's your point? Is your point that therefore you need to keep following commandments, saying the prayers, doing all of that, or that gets taken away from you, right? And in which case, if you believe that, then there's really no intellectual pursuit that's needed anymore. You've been given a set of rules like you were when you were a child, right? And it didn't matter whether you agreed with your parents' rule was, you knew that if you came in after 10 o'clock, you were going to get punished, so you better come in before 10 o'clock. You know, you sort of go in that direction. Or if that's not the case, then you'd say, well, why does it matter where it comes from? Other than I just don't want to get a swelled head and a big ego and all of that, sort of who cares? So I find, I'm not rejecting this idea, but I'm just saying I find on two different levels, there are a lot of challenging things that flow from accepting that.
So I want to address the second thing you're saying. Well, first of all, the first point you make about, well, if we have misfortune in our life, is that due to God punishing? And actually, what the rabbis explain, and it says a little bit in the next two verses, which I left off, which this idea that if you don't do, if you forget that where everything came from, then things will start to kind of fall apart for you. So it's not so much that it's a punishment, but that when you kind of get a full head, then things may start to go poorly for you. Now, you could be on the right mindset and things are going poorly for you as well, right? So that does still maintain this difficulty. But actually, I want to shift to the second point you're making, which is that, so you got two daughters. And I imagine there have been times that the girls were given allowance. One of them may still be receiving allowance. I don't know, maybe both of them are still receiving allowance. I don't know. It's not my place to ask, right? But if you give them, let's say that they need to be able to, I don't know, they need to be able to get something. And so you give them some money to be able to get whatever it is they need, but then they squander that money and they waste it on something else, right? You'd probably be upset that, like, here, I gave you $100 to get an outfit, for the beginning of the school year. Wouldn't that be lovely, right? But now you went and spent that $100 on, I don't know, on really outrageous, manicure, like crazy acrylics and like a whole big to do, who knows what, right? Like, why would you spend that money? Why would you waste that money? That's not what I gave you. That's not why I gave you the money. And so in a way you could see also that God is saying, well, I've gifted you the ability to do these things, but it's not just to go off and be able to serve yourself. It's to be able to fulfill my mitzvot. And my mitzvot are sometimes about serving me, God, but you serve me, God, by performing the mitzvot, which for the most part are about setting up a just society. So if you say, I can't spare, $1 for the person that I'm passing on the street, because it's my money or whatever, well, God would say, well, I only enabled you to be able to earn that money so that you could also then help my people. Now, of course, you might say, well, I'm not going to give $1 to the person on the street because I don't necessarily know that person, but I do give $1,000 to this nonprofit that deals, that serves those who are unhoused. And so you're just saying, well, I'm just directing my funds to a different channel, right? That's fine. Right? But if you say, I'm not going to give any of my money away because this is my money, this is what I earned, well, that's problematic, because God would say, the only reason I enabled you to be able to earn that money is to be able to make sure that all of my people are cared for. And so if you try to play the system to not have to pay as much tax, right? Whatever it might be, finding whatever loopholes, even if it's legal, but maybe it's not really ethical, right? You are kind of cheating a system by defunding schools or our first responders or whatever else our taxes what might be going to in that case. And so we have this idea of like, well, remembering why we even have the ability to do these things in the first place. So it's, and the idea of not wasting it, not wasting that opportunity. Right. I want to go a little bit further into the text because we've been going for a while here. So I want to take a look at, so what is the problem with forgetting? We've already touched on this a bit, but the rabbis actually take it to even a bit more extreme of a place, which I think is really, powerful and relevant for the conversation. So we do have a Rabbeinu Bachya here, even though there's another one that's much longer, we do have this one. So Rabbeinu Bachya says, and you will say in your heart, like, lest you say in your heart, my strength and the power of my hand, that's what gave me this ability. Moses says that possibly your arrogance will become such that you ascribe your affluence to your horoscope, to Mazal, right? The word we're using, horoscope. The word kochi, my strength, would refer to influences from outer space, astrological in nature. The word otzem yedi, my efforts, would refer to subterrestrial influences, demons resident below earth, right? So this idea, like the idea of koach, is this whole idea that certain things happen in our lives because of a mazal. And this is not, it's weird, like this idea of astrology, which I actually ascribe, like I buy into astrology to a degree, maybe not like crazy deep, but I do buy into it. More like it helps create some sense of order in the world than it predestines, right? But there's a conversation here in the Talmud, in Masechet Sota, that we're about to look at, where the rabbis have a whole conversation about, depending on what day of the week you were born, you'll have different characteristics, different traits, different personality. And then the rabbis go a little bit further, say, no, it's not so much about the day on which you're born, but it's more about the sign under which you were born, right? So somebody who's born under Saturn versus somebody who's born under Mercury versus somebody who's born under Venus versus somebody who's born under like whatever the different signs might be. Depending on that, that can have a different impact on who you grow into becoming, like who you grow into, the person you become. And at the end of that whole conversation, Rabbi Yochanan steps in and says, Rabbi Yochanan said in his own statement, any person who has arrogance within him is considered as if he has denied the core belief in God's existence. As it is stated, then your heart be lifted up and you forget Adonai your God. They go into a whole conversation after this, which wasn't worth going into, but really about how this ties in. But the idea here is that so many people think that either their own efforts or the influence of a mazal, of constellations, can actually be what has led somebody to be able to do something. So if anybody who believes that you have denied this core idea of God playing a role in our lives. And then Baal Shem Tov takes it kind of all the way there. And I think this is really awesome here. So Baal Shem Tov, right, the founder of Hasidic Judaism. Lest your heart grow haughty and you forget Adonai your God. They said in the Gemara, in the Talmud, in Tractate Sota, as we just saw, this is a warning to the proud in spirit, as it is written, lest your heart grow haughty and you forget. The Rav Moshe Mikotzi counted this as a negative commandment and wrote that God revealed to him in a dream that the essential warning of all the Torah is the commandment to remember, and that forgetting, which is the opposite, God forbid, God forbid, destroys the whole Torah. Right? So as long as you remember, in this case, you remember God, that is the essence and that is the core of everything from the Torah comes from. And if you forget God, then it's as if you've destroyed the whole Torah. So before, I'll read the rest of this and then I'll go back to explain that a bit more. So as it is with an individual, so it is with humanity. Exile flows from forgetting and redemption flows from remembering. As it says in Kohelet, the words of a wise man's mouth find favor. Okay, so what he's saying here, it's really amazing. Why do we even do any of the mitzvot? And the Torah is really all about mitzvot. It's because of God. And if we forget the role of God, then we cut off the entire Torah. And it begins with ourselves. If we go about and think that we can cause whatever we want to happen, then that is the beginning of forgetting God. And when we begin to forget God, what is the point of the rest of the Torah? Right? We only perform the mitzvot because God commanded us. Well, what do we care if God commanded us if we forget everything that God has given us? If we lose that indebtedness to God. Right? But if we remember that we are in debt to God, and we remember that gratitude, that appreciation, then we'll say, of course, Is it so much to ask of me to say Shakol Niyeh Bivaro before I drink my water? Is it so much to ask of me to bless Birkat Hamazon after I've had a meal? Is it so much to ask of me to say Shema? Just these little things, just to remind ourselves of where everything comes from, right? It shouldn't be that much to ask as long as we remember that stuff. But if we forget that, and haughtiness is the beginning of forgetting that, right? Then things will start to crumble down around us. Right? We stop helping out other people, and we feel like, why do we need to have a society where those who are marginalized are supported? Well, what happens if all of a sudden we're down in our luck, and we said, well, that doesn't matter. So now all of a sudden we are hurting because of that decision as well. But if we all remember that God wants us to look out for one another, to have a just society, that we are all responsible for one another, then things will go well for us kind of no matter what. You could live in a society, like, instead of being thrown in prison for 50 years and they throw away the key, that you can find yourself in a rehab facility that really focuses on some early childhood trauma that led to the decisions that you had to make that got you in prison in the first place. And we decide we want to have a society that wants to rehabilitate people. And all of a sudden, things are looking better. And we decide that schools are really important, and we want to make sure that our teachers are paid really well so that knowledge can really flow freely. And it's all about caring for everyone, like realizing that we're all in this together, and that it's all so that we can follow God's vision. If we stop doing that, then things start to crumble around us, as we are starting to see. Yeah, thoughts and reflections on all this, because this is really, I think, probably the most powerful aspect of this teaching.
So if you were to either make up or choose a prayer, or make up a prayer that would encapsulate this idea, what would that prayer be? How would you say it? Or is there a prayer that
I go something like this. Moda
sorry.
ani lefanecha, melech chai v'kayam, shechazarta bi nishmati b'chemla rabba emunotecha. Grateful am I, right? Grateful am I before you, God, right? Lefanecha, melech chai v'kayam, this living and sustaining God, shechazarta bi nishmati, that you return my soul to me b'chemla, with this grace. Chemla is that you don't do anything to deserve that act of kindness, but God still shows us that kindness to return our souls to us. Why? Because Rabba emunatecha, God has great faith that we will use that gift of our soul, of another day, to actually do good with it, to make the world a little bit better, to make other people feel better about themselves, to try to save our environment around us, to try to fight for a just government and a just society and a just economy. And that's why the very first word off of our lips in the morning, before we open our eyes, before we do anything else, we say modeh, grateful, not ani, not I. Right? I could say ani modeh. I acknowledge you, God, or I'm grateful, God, but rather we say modeh ani, or if you're a woman, moda ani. Right? Grateful am I. To get away from thinking of ourselves, getting away from that ego, as we spoke about last week, and trying to focus on something much larger. And when we get to that mindset, right, that's when things start flowing better and better. And that's when those good fortunes start coming. But that I think would be a pretty good prayer to start with.
Thank you.
Other thoughts, reflections, issues with this? Yeah, Joel.
Sure, Rabbi. Supporting your contention, I always keep very close by this brass fitting. And I ask myself many times, how did these electrons, these protons come together? Of course, from God. And imbued man with the ability to manufacture it. Quick question, Shehecha Zarta, I was noticing one time that might be related to the word pig-eyed. I wake in the morning all pig-eyed. Chazar. Yes or no?
Never thought about it. So it comes from like chazar as in return. Like chazara, when you're gonna review something, you do chazara. And so that's chazar versus pig, which is chazer. So it has, the same consonants but different vowels. Who knows? Maybe, if anything, it would be the pig guy probably would be a newer concept than the blessing itself, Shechazarta. But I've actually never even heard that term in English. So yeah, I love the fact that you keep the that fitting there, and I always try to have these conversations with my daughter about like, well, God's in this couch, and God's in the phone, and God's in you, and God's in me, and the ability to have all this stuff happen. I like it. Also makes me think a lot of how this philosophy can fit into, in a way, into the mindset of the greatest generation, right? That how many people, Jews, from the greatest generation, so our parents and grandparents, for those of us who are here in this conversation today, how many of them like really found great success, financial success, right? I often will, I perform, officiate funerals, and these wonderful stories about people who built themselves up from nothing, and whether they survived through the Great Depression and they had nothing, or maybe their families had a lot, and then depression came, they lost everything, and they grew everything, had great success afterwards, or people who fled from Europe and they, had absolutely nothing. We hear it a bit more now with folks who like with baby boomers who were born in Iran, who oftentimes like they had a lot of success in Iran, and then to be able to leave everything, they had to leave everything behind. So they come to America with like nothing, and then they're able to build themselves up again. But when you have this idea that it's not so much mine, that things can disappear from my grasp very easily, right? It makes you, I think, maybe that much more willing to take a risk, because what's the worst that happens? I end up back on my tush again. Well, I've already been there before. I was able to make it work. I don't necessarily want to live like that for 20 years, but I can deal with that for 5 to 10 years, and before I get myself, back up on my feet again. But when you're living so well and so comfortably for so long, it's much more challenging, I think, to take those risks. And right, so I think I don't necessarily believe that the philosophy of everything being there is from God is part of the mindset that fed into the people who are able to make success coming from nothing. But I think the idea that nothing is ever truly yours, nothing is ever truly permanent anyways, you don't have complete control over that which is, over your fortunes anyways. I think that belief is what leads to success. And so you can kind of find the dovetailing between the two philosophies, and they do work quite well together as well. Other thoughts, other challenges to this? Do you think it's just complete malarkey? Or, I mean, you're obviously here at a Torah study group, so you probably don't think it's complete malarkey. But it's
interesting that in a way all territorial conquest by nations is forgetting this lesson, right? Because it's the notion, if you thought about that all of this land is God's land, then there would be less of an inclination to, well, I'm going to take it from them for me because it doesn't belong to them and it doesn't belong to me. But then there's that darn free will that the Creator gave us. So people then very cleverly said, well, wait a minute, I'm not doing it for me. I'm doing it for God because I'm going to the land of these savages and I'm bringing God with me and I'm doing it for God. And that's sort of, in a way, how I don't think they ever thought it through necessarily in an intellectually religious way, but it's sort of, that's how they got around the notion, with forgetting about being Jewish or not Jewish, of that it's not yours, so you can't take it, is to say, well, I'm not taking it for me, I'm taking it for God.
I think that very much is what plays it, right? I mean, yeah, I think the idea of Christian conquest of the new world, right? Definitely religion and God definitely plays a role there. I think Christian conquest of Africa, I think also played a large role there too. I'm thinking, Russell, about the terrible timing of the stay-at-home orders and then your neighbor's construction and losing the beautiful view from your home. but also like how you could just, it's very easy to get so upset. Like why, so I have to build a 2-story monstrosity right next to my house and I lose this beautiful view that I had. But then you could also say, well, thank God I had an incredible view for as long as I had it. And it wasn't mine anyways. So how fortunate was I that I was able to have that view for as long, and good. Now these people get to have the view and we get to share it, and hopefully they'll be able to appreciate God's creation as well. And maybe I'll just have to take a lawn chair and put it on my roof to be able to see something nice for every now and then. But right, I think it's really easy to get so caught up in feeling that things that are ours are taken away from us. And I think it's really, really challenging to get into the mindset that nothing ever is truly ours. Right? That even if I say like this phone, I might say it's mine, but really it's not mine. It's made up of a whole bunch of different elements that are God's, and God gave some people the brilliance of mind to be able to engineer something like this. And God gave other people the ability to work and to do the efforts to mine the minerals and elements and to be able to work in the factories to make it and to drive it to the store for me to be able to get it. And right, and then I just say, I am simply the custodian for this. And just as I want to make sure that God's world is not destroyed, I want to make sure that all of God's belongings are not destroyed. And so I'm its custodian, I'm not its owner. It's a thing of really difficult mindset. Yeah, Carol.
I wanted to share that in the early to mid 90s, I worked for the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services after the Topanga, Malibu, Calabasas firestorm. And after experiencing that, whenever I would leave my home, which was in Topanga at the time, I would say to myself, am I okay if when I come home, nothing's there? And most people who had lived through that, and many of them, I think over 300 families or more, did lose their homes and everything that they had. And, I was thinking about, is it mine to begin with? And it kind of has played into that. And as much as I love my artwork and where I live and what I live in, I would be fine without all of it.
It's tough. Thank God we actually have, these days, like everything can be digital, right? So take photos of your artwork. God forbid there's a fire, you lose your art. Well, you can always still kind of sit there and look at a photo on some other device because it's all saved in the cloud. Of course, there could be a terrible catastrophe when everything is just lost, right? Your physical belongings are lost, and all the data floating around in the cloud is completely destroyed as well. Like that is a possibility, but we do live in a day and age when the physical in front of us is far less important than the ephemeral, living in the cloud somewhere. And so, we could technically be anywhere as long as you have a roof over your head, you have some food in your belly, clothes on your back. So you're safe. Not that you have abundance, but as long as you have the bare essentials so that you're safe and provided for, right? Everything else is secondary. And even those bare essentials, we have to remember, are still from God. So I'm going to leave it here. So thank you, everybody, for contributing to the conversation. If you want to, if you're at the website, if you download the PDF, you can see what Rabbeinu Bachya says on the last page, the last 2 pages. It's a pretty long one that just speaks to more of this concept of astrology, constellations, strength, what's actually ours versus supernatural. I should say supernatural outside of the realm of God, right? But I also want to say it is quite likely that this will probably be our last Torah Tuesday for the next couple of months. Phil, we haven't had this conversation yet. I'm going to speak with Cindy about it tomorrow. But just because of the high holidays coming up in just over 6 weeks, I want to make sure that I have as much time as possible focused on high holiday preparations and all that. And this does take time throughout the week to teach as well as to prepare the teaching and all that. So,
well, Yasher Koach, Rabbi, for an incredibly beautiful teaching today and all these wonderful sessions we've had.